So in this study, in this video, by the way, you can see Ekman describing how they manipulated the faces to like systematically measure these components. But what Ekman and Friesen did in 1978 is they took faces such as these and surveyed different cultures. They gave them all the same faces, and they also gave them a list of emotion words to match with the facial expression. So, if there was a face like number 1 here, a happy face, they wanted to see if someone could properly label that face, or if there was consistency in labeling it across cultures. Typically, what they found was that across cultures, the facial recognition was matched quite frequently. So, meaning people in different cultural groups were able to match the faces, or I shouldn't say were able, consistently match the faces in similar amounts of time. So, someone in China would match a face as happy in a percentage that was large, and could be compared to the North American people. Maybe they matched the happy one the same a certain amount of time. So comparing those numbers, how they similarly identified the emotions. This was the idea that there are universally recognized emotional facial expressions. So this idea was supported in that people of different cultures reacted similarly to different faces. But there were varied recognition rates. So, there were some instances where people were not able to recognize the faces. And this was obviously enough to the point where Ekman was like, well, what could be the difference in this study? Why can't people recognize these faces? Right, the matching was easy, but recognizing it was another task. And there's an idea that there was differences in display rules, and maybe this affected how people perceive the faces. For example, oh, here we go. I found it on page 3 of this section, if you print it out like me. Display rules are just the idea that different cultures have different ways to display their emotions with the face. So sometimes people have different ways of shaking their head that can mean different things. The example used in our text is that in India, there is a sign where someone bites their tongue. In biting their tongue, this conveys embarrassment. Now, in the United States, us biting our tongue doesn't really carry a value that's consistent across our culture. So that's kind of looking at the differences in how we display our emotions. So even though a lot of people were able to match the picture with the correct emotion, there were a lot of people who weren't able to recognize different emotions, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's how I'm going to say that. So across cultures, generally people were more able to correctly identify the faces with the appropriate emotion, but on the whole, there were some discrepancies, and those could be attributed to display rules. Now, we're going to look at individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. If you don't know, individualistic cultures focus on the self, or the individual, and individual achievement, and standing out, and being expressive, and being high arousal. This is very typical of North American culture. Whereas collectivistic cultures focus more on the benefit of the group and how an individual can contribute to the group. This is seen in East Asian cultures, so it's identifying the self in terms of roles. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 looked at models of the self. So, they found that typically North American people had an independent model of the self. So this idea that they had to differentiate from the group and also influencing others. That's a component of this model of the self. You're independent, but you're also seeking to influence others. A very high arousal. very expressive with emotions. Whereas East Asians typically are interdependent, so they're very focused on working with others, putting the group needs above themselves, suppressing and adjusting emotions when necessary. So not too much, not as pretty low arousal, and they don't convey as many emotions as independent models of the self. So Cousins in 1989 wanted to look at how different cultures represented themselves and look more into the models of the self. So what Cousins did in 1989 was give different people what is called the 20 statements test. And this has been used multiple times in psychology in different domains. It's a good way to test self-concept or your idea of yourself. And the results were that typically North American people, in this test, simply, you are given the prompt, I am blank, 20 times, and you have to fill in the different responses. So maybe you'll say, I am a mom. Maybe I am tall. I am a brother, right? So they wanted to look at how people self-identified. And this is largely influenced by the models of the self. Because North American people often describe themselves by their trait or traits they valued, whereas East Asian people define themselves by their roles in the group. And this can lead to principles for interacting with others, so it can guide us, right? Independent people seek to influence others. I think of an Instagram influencer. I don't know if that helps you remember it, but there you go. Whereas interdependent people look to adjust their emotions and even suppress them when necessary for the benefit of the group. Now, that suppression, I know we think, oh, it's bad to suppress your emotions, or maybe you've never given it any thought. But when we hear that, sometimes it can carry a negative connotation. So Freud in 1910 wanted to look at it. It said that emotional suppression and repression impair psychological functioning. Now, this is true of independent models of the self, or North Americans, because our culture values expressing emotions, right? Having high arousal, influencing others. So in European American culture, it is highly valued to express your emotions. To suppress them often leads to higher levels of depression and lower levels of life satisfaction because you are not expressing yourself to the fullest extent. Now, suppression of emotions in Hong Kong Chinese, that is just a part of everyday life. So that culture is going to affect their perceptions of emotional conveyance. So saying, hey, I want to express this emotion, or hey, I want to hide this emotion. And our culture is going to dictate whether that's a quote-unquote good or bad thing. Typically what we find is that in relation to depression, European Americans are more likely to be depressed with muted emotional responses, whereas East Asian Americans are the opposite. When depressed, they tend to express more emotions because that's outside of the norm of their culture, right? The norm is to suppress those emotions, and they kind of go with the opposite, and that's an indicator of depression. And this is very important for working with people of different cultures, especially if you are going to be a counselor for some reason. It's good to have cultural competence to understand how culture affects people's perceptions, how they interact with the world, and how that culture influences their emotional portrayal, or even how they communicate different things to you. Because sometimes in some cultures it's not appropriate to speak to a counselor because it can make the family look bad, right? So there's all these different cultural norms and rules that affect things so seemingly personal as emotions. Now, do people across cultures feel the same in similar situations? So if you had a top score on a test that was graded on a curve, how would you feel? Well, if you don't know what this means, that means that y'all took a test and you scored the best. Maybe you didn't get 100%, but everyone else kind of did so poorly that yours was the top grade and you're going to be used as the 100%, so to speak. So how would you feel? You might feel happy because, hey, you got the top score. It doesn't matter what everyone else got, right? Well, let's take a look in different situations. Between North American and East Asian students, if they were in this situation, typically what we find that with good experiences, such as achieving a good grade that was a good grade on a test that was graded on a curve, North Americans will rarely feel bad. And this kind of goes with the model of the self, looking at independence and all the good qualities they have. Whereas East Asian students might assess their emotions, they'll see the bad and the good. So they see the good in their personal achievement, but they also see the bad in that other people performed worse off, or other people who performed poorly were compared to themselves. So they're looking again, how is that influenced by culture? Because East Asian people tend to focus on the group. Remember that interconnectedness, that collectivistic culture. So they're going to value their own experience in this situation, but also understand that, hey, that means other people didn't do so well. Or, hey, they're being compared to me, so, I wish they kind of did better. That's the idea here. Now, this is a really interesting map in your text, and I'm hoping you'll be able to understand it. So it's looking at a two-dimensional map of affective states. So think of the two dimensions as the crosshairs right here in the middle, up and down and horizontal, vertical and horizontal. An affective state is just the type of emotional arousal one feels, coupled with its intensity from pleasant to unpleasant, high to low. So we're looking at the level of arousal as well as intensity. So if you see on this vertical measure, you see high arousal and low arousal. In this horizontal measure, we're looking at levels of unpleasantness to pleasantness and all the different variances in between, which are really interesting if you get a chance to look at them. For example, high arousal and pleasant. This is what happens when someone is enthusiastic, elated, excited, euphoric. Those are the different emotions we associate with being at a level of high arousal stimulation with pleasant experiences. Now, if we looked at low arousal, unpleasant, this spectrum could be independent selves, for example, because typically independent selves look for high arousal and pleasantness. While on the opposite end of the spectrum, low arousal and unpleasantness, someone may feel dull, sleepy, sluggish, maybe even lead to depression. So kind of review this little chart. It's pretty interesting in how we measure affective states on these axes. Now, these different emotional lives and purpose to communication. So again, I just want to reiterate that point. Independent self is going to influence others and try to inspire to action. In this hyperlink, I've linked different makeup tutorials. You don't have to watch them in full, but just watch the beginning. You'll see kind of the difference in even a more Western approach to a makeup video as opposed to a more Eastern approach to a makeup video, kind of demonstrating the idea of the independent self, their desire to influence others and have this high energy, high arousal and action, whereas this video kind of demonstrates that interdependent self, attending to others, giving others this information, and suspending actions in their space. So make a note, try to just check out the first minute of each of these videos and you'll see the difference. You'll see that kind of those different senses of the self, different models of the self at work. Now, why do we compare cultures? We want to prevent miscommunications, right? We want to understand that maybe we have a coworker who is of East Asian descent, right? Or Asian American. There's different cultural standards that come with their displays of emotion. And sometimes they can lead to stereotypes people have about them Maybe that they don't want to involve themselves with the group, right? Maybe they're seen as this perpetual foreigner because we don't have an understanding of how they convey their emotions and what's seen as their norm. Whereas we are very loud and expressive in North American context, and Asian American, depending on their cultural upbringing, could be more reserved. And this reservation is not necessarily an unwillingness to involve themselves in any ventures, but more of that's the norm of how they're supposed to carry themselves and wear their emotions, so to speak. It gives us insights into other paths to psychological health and well-being. So what is going to be characteristic of depression in one culture may not necessarily be characteristic of depression in another culture. As we mentioned previously, there's going to be differences in assessments, and they're going to vary, and those diagnoses are going to vary based on the cultural context. So it's important to take that in and understanding what is abnormal in those cultures when we can be so different across the globe. And also looking at that cultural competence and understanding how others convey themselves and how their models of themselves affect their emotions, right? Because we have this idea that people have an ideal affect. A culture is going to affect how we ideally want to act, right? And then there's also going to be things that affect our actual affect, so how we actually feel in situations. So the ideal, think of we're striving towards that, and the actual is what actually happens. So how are cultural differences and beliefs about emotions transmitted? Right, there's all different types of means. Media is huge for influencing these. But we're going to look at how cultural ideas are reflected in and reinforced by practices, institutions, and products. So products could be media consumption, practices could be everyday interactions, and institutions can be things such as school. How do we facilitate emotional regulation in those places? Right, so an example of a study that was done by Say et al. In 2007 looked at children's storybooks, and they wanted to see if we could influence children's beliefs about emotions through the stories that they read. So in the US, children were given more exciting and less calm content than children in Taiwan. So they really wanted, that's typically what we've seen on the bookshelves. So students in the US who are looking for books typically see a lot more smiley faces, a lot more high energy type activities in the book as opposed to Taiwan. So these researchers wanted to see how the story could influence emotional values. So one group of students was read a story about something high energy with high arousal, very much following with that idea of the independent self. Whereas the other group was read a story about a low arousal state, something a little more casual and low-key. And this result found that whatever story the children read, it influenced their emotional values. Also, the link is here if you want to read it. Not only did it influence the children's emotional values, or what they thought were, the ideal affect, what they should strive to achieve in terms of their emotional presentation, but this story also influenced their toy choice. So children with the higher arousal level and more exciting stories, so to speak, choose higher level arousal toys such as beating on a drum, and vice versa. So it's very interesting to see how cultural products and tools can kind of affect our perceptions or affect how we regulate our emotions and how we strive to present our emotions in a certain way. So that's why this week we're going to talk about emotional regulation in terms of the media we consume with our pop culture excitement. Now, we talk about temperament, and you may have heard this word before. Most commonly it's used when someone's like, oh, yeah, have you met my baby, she's such a good baby. You know, she sleeps really well. She's really easy to figure out when she wants something, right? That's this biological predisposition to respond in a certain way. Like a mood, it's pretty consistent across a variety of areas. And what we found in terms of looking at ideal affect, or how we ideally want to emote, compared to our actual affect, or how we really emote, right? Maybe you want to present yourself as happy and high energy, but in actuality, you're kind of somewhere in the middle and you're content. So not exactly happy, but not exactly sad, right? Well, cultural factors. So think about that storybook. Think about our cultural norms. Those are going to affect how we formulate our ideal affect. They're going to mold how we think we should emote. Whereas temperamental factors are going to look into how we actually emote. So, how our biological predisposition affects how we respond in different situations. And your actual affect, so how we really emote, is going to affect our physiological arousal, right? Please note that for reading this little diagram, you see that temperament is going to affect the ideal affect as well as the actual affect, but it's much stronger with the actual affect, as indicated by this bold line. Anyway, tangents. But the actual affect is going to affect our physiological arousal, so those physical symptoms of our different emotions. Whereas our ideal affect is going to affect our conceptions of mental health and our mood-producing behavior. So our ideal affect, let's say we strive to be happy, high energy, engage in high arousal activities, right? That's going to be the ideal affect. That's what we want to achieve. And that's going to form our conceptions of mental health if we're living up to those standards. But if we aren't, we may not be living up to those conceptions of mental health, and it may actually cause us to become depressed because we aren't meeting that ideal affect. Oh, well, I forgot that was the last slide. So, I know that this was a lot. I'm trying to condense the videos because I don't want to do as much hand-holding. I really want you to make sure you read the content, and as always, let me know if you have any questions. Part 3 will be available Sunday.